Good day, everyone. For today, our group is here to discuss about developing recommendations for clinical preventive services. For this chapter, we are going to tackle about the United States Preventive Services Task Force, their mission and history, underlying assumption, evidence review, and recommendation. Next is the economics of prevention, the overuse, underuse, and misuse of screening. Next is the major recommendations. Their highly recommended services, limits of evidence, and clinical preventive services compliance, and lastly, the community-based prevention. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force was founded in 1984. It was modeled on an earlier Canadian task force to serve as an independent panel of experts on prevention and evidence-based medicine. Since 1995, the task force has worked under the Agency of Healthcare, Research, and Quality. It covers all primary and secondary preventive services, including screening, counseling, and specific chemoprophylaxis. The task force aimed to provide accurate and balanced recommendations across a spectrum of populations, type of services, and disease types. Its mission is to access the benefit and harm of delivering preventive services to asymptomatic individuals and to recommend which services should be incorporated into primary health care. This mission is very circumscribed. The United States Preventive Services Task Force only considers screenings of asymptomatic patients, and it only deals with preventive services within primary care. Often, however, the USPSTF recommendations are criticized by specialist organizations. Specialists may primarily see pre-selected patients with subtler symptoms that were missed earlier or may see high-risk groups. Screening decisions for such patients may be different from those for the general population, because the pretest probability of disease is much higher. On the other hand, recommendations of USPSTF are sometimes used for insurance decision about which screening test to cover. In these cases, recommendations may be more broadly applied than intended. The USPSTF does not take cost effectiveness or financial concerns into consideration. When the USPSTF was founded, its principles were revolutionary: that preventive care should be rigorously evaluated, and that not every screening test was worth doing. In its history, USPSTF has often recommended against or failed to endorse screening tests that were recommended by other organizations. The reason for this reluctance to endorse some interventions may be based on several assumptions of the task force. Moving on to the underlying assumptions. Screening studies are subject to many biases that leads researchers to overestimate benefits. Therefore, the task force places a higher burden of evidence for benefits than for evidence of harm. For benefits, USPSTF will only accept evidence from randomized controlled trials, community trials, meta-analyses, or systematic reviews. However, it will take into account evidence of cohort studies and case control studies in calculations of harm. For their assumptions, preventive studies describe the upper bounds of efficacy. In other words, controlled trials describe a best case scenario with well trained and highly motivated providers and patients. The task force assumes that in the real world, with unselected providers and in the general population, the effectiveness of a screening program will be lower. Delivering of a screening services is not an outcome. The diagnosis of a disease also is not an outcome. Therefore, the benefit of a screening program lies not in the number of patients screened or the number of patients diagnosed with disease, but only in the health outcomes. USPSTF will give no weight to evidence of the number of screening events or cases found, and it will give greater weight to studies of health outcomes than to those of intermediate outcomes. Because the standard for evidence is so high, USPSTF will wait longer than other organizations before endorsing screening modalities. The number of patients' lives potentially saved must be weighed against the risk of subjecting healthy patients to potentially harmful screening tests. With this tension and when in doubt, the task force seems to prefer being late to being wrong. Developing a recommendation is a two-part process: reviewing the evidence and formulating recommendations. Although the task force itself makes the recommendations, independent center reviews the evidence. USPSTF has established 12 such evidence-based practice centers. The literature review and recommendation process is highly structured and includes various steps to safeguard the task force integrity and to help it pursue its goal of transparency, accountability, consistency, and independence. Safeguards include stringent criteria for selection of members, stringent policy regarding conflict of interest, dual review of each abstract, and a comment period for community partners and the public. Here are the critical appraisal questions that they use to assess the evidence. Do the studies have the appropriate research design to answer the key questions? What is the internal validity? What is the external validity? How many studies have been conducted that address the key questions, and how large are the studies? How consistent are the results? And are there additional factors that raise confidence in the results? Here are the procedures in developing a recommendation statement. First is the topic selection, where the responsible parties include the topic prioritization work group, a subset of task force members, and AHRQ and EPC staff. What happens is that the work group meets periodically throughout the year. Next is the work plan development. The parties involved include the EPC, who will write work plans with guidance from a topic team consisting of 3 or 4 USPSTF members and a medical officer from AHRQ. From start to finish, these activities, development, peer review, and approval takes 3 to 6 months. Third is the external work plan peer review, where work plans are reviewed by experts in the field, and the approval of peer-reviewed work plan, where all members of USPSTF are involved, and the draft evidence report, wherein evidence reports are written by EPC or by AHRQ medical officers, depending on topic. All of these are typically completed within 6 to 4 months, depending on the scope of the topic. Next is the peer review of draft evidence report by experts and partners, where all draft evidence reports are sent to the limited number of experts in the field, and 6 federal partners for review and task force leaders are asked to comment on draft evidence report. The draft recommendation statement, which includes the task force members and draft recommendation statement with HRQ medical officer and the USPSTF review of evidence, and vote on draft recommendation statement, in which all members of the USPSTF participate in. These three are usually completed within 2 to 4 weeks. For the final evidence report, EPC and HRQ medical officer incorporate reviews, comments, and finalized evidence report. Then it is submitted to AHRQ within 3 to 6 months after USPSTF vote. After that, peer review of draft recommendation statement by 22 partners of the USPSTF typically have 2 to 3 weeks to review draft recommendation statement. Furthermore, approval of final recommendation statement by the task force members of the USPSTF members typically approve recommendation statement as final within 1 to 2 months. Lastly, it's time for the release of the recommendation statement and evidence report by the AHRQ. Staff where time from vote to release and recommendation varies. Once an evidence review is complete, USPSTF members vote on the 8 key questions to determine if screening for a condition X is recommended. Key questions include: does screening for X reduce morbidity and or mortality? Can a group at high risk for X be identified on clinical grounds? Are accurate screening tests available? Are treatments available that make a difference in intermediate outcomes when a disease is caught early? Are treatments available that make a difference in morbidity and mortality when the disease is caught early? How strong is the association between the intermediate outcomes and the patient outcomes? What are the harms of the screening test? And lastly, what are the harms of the treatment? Once task force members have answered these questions, the group assigns a grade for the service of A, B, C, D, or I. After assigning a tentative grade, the task force discusses these recommendations with federal and primary care partners. Federal partners include the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Health Resource and Services Administration, the National Institute of Health, and Food and Drug Administration. Examples of primary care partners include the American Medical Association, American College of Physicians, and American College of Preventive Medicine. The results of the evidence review and the task force recommendations are posted for comments by the partners and the public, published in reputable journals, and disseminated on the internet. In clinical practice, there is little difference between grades A and B recommendations. In both cases, the service should be strongly encouraged. Services with grades of C, D, and I should not be routinely used. However, it is important to understand the difference between these grades. For grades A through D, USPSTF is reasonably certain it understands the balance of benefits and harm. For services graded C, there is a net benefit, but it is still likely small. A service with a C recommendation is breast cancer screening for women younger than 50. Decisions about these C services should be individualized. In contrast, for services graded D, there is clear evidence that there is no net benefit or that there is net harm. An example is screening for ovarian cancer. These D services should be avoided. For services with an I grade, evidence is lacking or conflicting, and the task force has determined that they can neither recommend or nor recommend against the service. As of 2012, services with an I grade include skin cancer screening, colorectal cancer screening with CT colonography, and screening for lung cancer using helical CT. These services require the most time to discuss. Inpatients and clinicians should engage in shared decisions making to understand consequences of testing and of not testing, as well as the patient's risk preferences. Such shared decision making is not only time consuming but also requires some sophisticated evaluation of trade offs on both sides.
I will now discuss the economics of prevention because health services aren't cheap. Specifically, I'll be discussing screening as a clinical program through the lens of cost effectiveness. Before that, however, I should elaborate on why the economic aspect is important. Clinical programs cost money, and funding them on a scale large enough to affect the nation's overall public health means that priorities have to be set. Imagine the overall effort to be like a chart of diminishing returns, with the x-axis representing overall money and effort put into health policy and y-axis representing actual benefit to public health. The goal of clinical preventive services is to choose the programs with the best cost effectiveness. Now, screening programs are highly effective at maintaining public health. For example, screening programs for hypertension, obesity, dyslipidemia, as well as colorectal, cervical, and breast cancer for women over 50, have proven themselves to be effective for the prevention/treatment of those conditions that would have otherwise gone through their natural progression unimpeded. As you can see in the chart below, the US Clinical Preventive Services have assigned to various clinical programs a ranking based on their clinically preventable burden, CPB, and cost effectiveness, CE, on a scale of 1 to 5. Added together, they give a good standard measure on what programs have the highest impact and are the most cost effective. However, screening services are prone to being overused and misused. In the US, Medicare subsidizes most of the cost of screening services. In theory, this allows for a large part of the populace to make use of health services they could not have otherwise. In practice, elderly patients, as well as patients with very poor outcomes, as well as those who are on death's door, take advantage of these services and overuse them despite being unlikely to benefit. Therefore, a challenge in preventative services is rethinking delivery of care and creating specific chronic care programs targeting those specific populations so that health subsidies are spent optimally.
In highly recommended services, the United States Preventive Services Task Force, based on extensive evaluation of the available evidence, these recommendations assist healthcare providers and patients in making informed preventive care decisions. In limits of evidence, they examine studies and data from well-designed research studies to determine the benefits and risks of specific preventive services. However, there may be limitations in the available evidence in some cases, such as insufficient data or conflicting results, which can affect the strength of recommendations. And lastly, the clinical preventive service compliance. This includes implementing the USPSTF guidelines into routine clinical practice and ensuring that eligible people get the right screenings, interventions, or treatments.
Recommended services for optimal health aside, the process of delivering these screening programs to the people should also be discussed. On a national level, the vast majority of preventive services are still underused, at least in the US. To that end, the CDC has recommended a solution based on community collaboration. If screening services could be detached from the clinic and be applied directly to the community, then it's the next natural step for the optimization of delivery. One example of this kind of community collaboration can be seen in the sickness prevention achieved through the regional collaboration model, otherwise known as the SPARK model. Established in order to implement community-wide strategies to better deliver clinical preventive services, the people behind the program have tried various methodologies. For example, they attached vaccination and screening programs to community events, such as during the conducting of polls for elections, and community programs such as Meals on Wheels. Aside from successfully increasing rates of vaccination and screening, this model encouraged accountability at the community level for the delivery of preventive services. However, overuse and misuse of preventive services can still occur, just as it can when delivered at a clinic. Preventive services can be aided by community collaboration to prevent underuse, but care must be taken to avoid overuse and misuse as well.